Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. World leaders gathering in China are wrapping up the Group of 20 summit in Hangzhou. Although the point of the summit was to address sluggish global growth, it seemed at times that it was the side meetings that grabbed the headlines, with the ratification by the US and China on fighting climate change, South China Sea tensions, and Britain's exit from the European Union, not to mention the refugee crisis, Syria, and a host of other issues. China hopes its status as this year's G20 leader will have increased its influence in global economic management. But what positive outcomes will we see from this summit? How far will it go in solving many of the world's most pressing problems? Joining me in the studio to answer these questions are Jiang Wenran, Global Fellow with the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and Charles Liu, founder of How Capital. But before we get started, let's look at this.
The spectacular opening gala of the G20 summit in Hangzhou may have impressed the world, but when it comes down to serious business, world leaders still face daunting challenges. The world's recovery remains weak after the 2008 financial crisis, with the global jobless rate almost reaching 6%. Chinese President Xi Jinping urged the G20 members to resist protectionism and foster innovation to boost growth. He said the global economy can hardly recover without open trade and coordinated macroeconomic policies among the G20 members.
It's a great success that China is hosting the G20. When Canada was very involved in creating the G20 back in the 1990s, one of the reasons for the fact that we needed a G20 and not just a G7 and others was because we had to have China involved in the discussions around the global economy.
I think China has confidence in its economy. It's a great role model for Brazil and other countries facing an economic recovery. The G20 Hangzhou summit presented great opportunities for others to learn from China.
Outside the summit, some notable meetings also grabbed headlines. President Xi met with his U.S. counterpart Barack Obama. Disagreements remain on thorny issues like the South China Sea, but one widely appreciated consensus was their climate change agreement. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon received the two countries' instruments for joining the Paris Agreement.
The actions taken by early ratifiers like China and the United States, those are two biggest emitters. I think they're far-reaching, visionary. They are working for the people. They are working for the planet Earth. The Sustainable Development Goals of climate change are tightly interlinked.
President Xi also met with South Korean President Park Geun-hye, reiterating China's objection to the U.S.'s deployment of an anti-missile defense system in South Korea. Xi warned her that tensions may escalate on all sides if the issue is not handled well. G20 economies account for 2/3 of the world's population and over 80% of global GDP and trade. Is widely seen as the most effective platform for global governance.
Gentlemen, what do you think are the most remarkable deliverables coming out of this just concluded G20 summit in Hangzhou?
Well, it looks like China emerged from being the major host as an organizer, putting up the show, inviting many of the other international organizations and the developing countries from Asia and Africa coming. So the focus is on China. I think China emerges to be the winner. Of course, President Obama looks very good with the Paris Climate Pact being signed. And so, using the Chinese phrase, it looks like a win-win situation for many parties who have come to the table.
But what are the most specific and practical deliverables that have been produced?
I don't think there is any, because that's not what the G20
Are you complaining that we don't have a secretariat for the G20 and therefore execution of some of the brilliant ideas will become a major problem?
There is no institutional backup to G20. It's not meant to be an institutional organization. It's not meant to be something that is action-oriented. It was always meant to be an extension, originally extension of the G7 to include developing countries.
May I just, Charles,
well, the world will be
disagree a little bit. I think, yes, there are a lot of talk shops, G7, G20, APEC, UN, many people actually dismiss these kind of international forums. But some groups, some people have to come together to deal with some of the very challenging issues. I think potentially, given where it is going, that's another thing. If there is a deliverable we can talk about, I think, is the institutional evolution. Believe it or not, maybe going beyond the talk shop, saying maybe set up a secretariat, maybe having a little bit more systemic approach in implementing what they discussed in the next G20 groups with some consistency. I think transition need to be in place, and China actually may provide that role. China may actually bankrolling it and finance such a secretariat and making it more institutional.
I would say the trend is actually against that. Why? Institutionalizing the G20, given a lot of the institutions which already exist, may be of interest to China, but the global geopolitical trend is against globalization further. It is the deglobalization. It is more populist nationalism.
In other words, regionalism is taking upper hand in the current competition against globalization. Is that the point?
Absolutely. If you look at Brexit, that's just one simple example. And the isolationism that is beginning to become quite pronounced in other countries in Europe.
Due to the rise of populism?
Refugee issues, immigration issue, economic policy issues. There are a lot of disputes among European member states versus the EU Secretariat.
And isn't it a major setback for the US government not to get the TPP approved by the time President Obama steps down by the end of this year? Because not only Donald Trump says no, but most of the Republicans in the Congress
and Democrats too
didn't give a damn about the TPP issue. And the economic minister of Germany said recently the negotiations about TTIP have basically failed.
And France as well, negative. Yeah. So therefore, it's not about regionalism. Regionalism, in fact, is something maybe globalization, but forming economic regional blocks. Now it is actually nationalism and isolationism. Brexit is actually against European regionalism. The talk about dismantling NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, by Trump, and to a certain extent alarmed reasoning by Clinton on these issues, is actually against even North American integration. And so you're looking at each on their own, some rule of Django kind of coming to play. So therefore, I think it's more important to emphasize collective inclusiveness, connectivity. I think some of the things in the G20, in President Xi's speech, some of those are, many points, but they actually strike the right tone in combating these kind of isolationist nationalist sentiment.
Your Prime Minister, your Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently said that the Canadian government is ready to join the AIIB despite the apparent uneasiness from your neighboring country of the United States. Do you think this is likely to undermine the momentum, uniqueness, cohesiveness and inclusiveness of NAFTA, one of the most successful regional blocs?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. I'm based in Canada, and he quoted saying the right things. He's one of those newly elected politicians against that trend we just discussed. He wanted more inclusiveness. He wanted a more stimulus, more coordinated approach to global economy for Canadian economy. So yes, joining AIIP is a good initiative, looks good for Canada. Canada will benefit from this. They didn't join as a founding member, in my opinion, was a mistake. I'm glad they corrected that, and that's a good stamp of approval for the new international institution like this.
President Obama and his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Xi Jinping, showed up on the center stage with Ban Ki-moon, Chief of the United Nations, to highlight the importance of climate change. The two governments want to join hands in fighting climate change, and this is one of the major side shows on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Hangzhou. What do you make of that?
Well, it makes outgoing UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon looks very good. He was very, happy. It makes Obama looks very good. He's a lame-duck president, and he delivered something that is very important for a lot of people in the world. And so the G2 among the G20 comes together They met some 4 hours of negotiations, huge tension differences, but meeting both teams to talk ahead of G20, that's very important for the G20 to succeed. So I would give it a plus. I'm not saying there are no tensions, tons of tensions on South China Sea regarding strategic issues, and yet they put on the best of the face. So this is exactly the complexity we're looking at. The new era of cooperation is really cooperation with conflicts, conflicts with cooperation, and if all parties can seek better cooperation and try to avoid escalation of conflict of issues, and then we actually have a better world. It's just not that easy, not black and white. It has to be, you're into this with negatives and positives in the mix.
Very articulate, but doves and hawks deliver different voices about the future of a most important bilateral relationship in the 21st century. For example, there has been much discussion about a quarrel that took place upon the arrival of President Obama at the airport of Hangzhou between, one junior official from the Chinese Foreign Ministry and Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor. Don't you think this is a little bit too much about the media fanfare, focusing or trying to figure out what went wrong with the United States and its relationship with China, particularly the host? Isn't it just an exaggeration? I mean, many more articles will emerge soon to clarify what has actually happened there at the tarmac upon the arrival of President Obama there. Well, what do you make of this event?
I mean, I think President Obama gave the best answer among all these mess of reports. I couldn't actually believe. I was looking at foreign press, The Guardian, Washington Post, and we're talking New York Times. We're talking about mainstream Western media, from Europe to the United States, even Canada, covering this as if it was conspiracy Chinese are going to do something about Obama, which is not the case. It's a mess, literally,
Does that reflect
logistics.
Does that actually reflect the media focus on the alleged Chinese assertiveness? They don't take Obama very seriously.
And makes more press and more
Eyeballs, catches more eyeballs.
So don't take it seriously.
One of the hallmarks of the media industry is sensationalism and trivialism. That's what I learned in the United Kingdom in the early 1990s when I was studying relationship between the government and mass media. You're watching Dialogue with Professor Jiang Wenran from Alberta, Canada, and Mr. Charles Liu. We are talking about the deliverables, if any, coming out of the just concluded G20 summit in Hangzhou. We'll be back in a few minutes. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, gentlemen. Welcome back, gentlemen. Since the 2008 financial crisis, the world economy has never fully recovered. What's the reason, or what are the reasons behind the very slow recovery? Charles?
Well, actually, I think if we look at what happened in 2008, every country dealt with it differently. China had 4 trillion RMB plus a lot of bank loans to build infrastructure. The West, especially the United States, had a TARP program, $700 billion, or unlimited amount, all of which went to shoring up the faltering financial institutions. Now Europe also is now arguing that maybe they should have done more fiscal policy. They should have done more infrastructure building instead of pumping all the money into the banks and financial institutions. These are some of the issues which are now being discussed, well, were discussed at the G20. It's a combination of monetary, but there has to be fiscal and other action that would help solve some of these problems. When the Chinese government slowed down its infrastructure building, what happens? The global economy went into a tailspin, and it's very clear because for most of the developing countries, export of raw materials was what driven their growth over the course of the last 5 years. So I think what happened is that 2008, the solution that was provided by different countries may not have addressed the core issues which existed. For those of us who travel a lot, the roads and the airports in the United States are certainly not something to be proud of.
They were built during the 1930s
exactly.
recession.
Or if you look at Charles de Gaulle, the airport in Paris, how does that compare with things not only in China, but also Singapore or Malaysia and so on?
Maybe they are mired deeply in the crisis of refugee, immigration, disintegration, perhaps, of the European Union.
Oh, that was part of what they created for themselves.
Let's get serious about the world economy. Wenran, why do so many countries, including both developed and developing nations, resort to fiscal stimulus and monetary easing policies?
Well, there are a lot of tools in the box to start with. As Charles mentioned, when you have the financial crisis followed by economic downturn, it was a profound world economic structure issue built up not by years but decades. And you have a very narrow set of nation-based national responses rather than effective global responses. We're talking about the problems with the Bretton Woods system. The post-war international economic financial architecture was not working in keeping up with the pace of globalization. So when you have a crisis like this, each region, each country trying to cover their own ground, and yet the recovery is sluggish. Charles mentioned China. Very few countries can compare with China's huge infrastructure input, and China continues to pour into it. But yet, at the same time, not only economically, you can't really deal with these issues with the international institutional update and reform. You get a bunch of issues politically in the destabilization of the Middle East, continuing pouring of the refugees into Europe, and then the European Union is facing crisis. And so you're seeing a multiple of issues that just dragging on. And the Chinese, remember a year ago, we're looking at the Chinese economy, people were basically saying there's going to be a crash, there will be a hard landing. Now China looks stabilized, G20 here is everything looking good, but people have short memories. They thought if China is going down the tube, then everybody else is going to get worse. So you have a lot of expectations and mix in between. So therefore, nobody really, even after today's G20, really put up a lot of really effective global level institutional changes, reforms that's needed for deal with the issues in the long term.
Charles, listing RMB as one of the major reserve currencies in the SDR basket of the IMF is of course one major step in the correct direction in internationalizing our currency, but also in upgrading the two multilateral financial institutions, the World Bank and an IMF, so to speak, because we've been talking about the functions, whether they are still working. That goes back to the Bretton Woods system. Now, do you think China will be a driving force? Because I've done a lot of homework, by the way, and China contributed up to 50% to world economic recovery between 2009 and 2011. And this year, that remains 30%. Yet most of the media coverage from the West choose not to focus on the enormous contribution China has made. How do you estimate the driving force behind the world economy?
I think it's unfortunate. I'm actually somewhat pessimistic about the world economy going into the near future. Too many geopolitical imponderables are driving this, including sanctions on Russia, including falling oil prices. What is really, I think, in China's contribution, in terms of China's contribution, it was a drive to build infrastructure since the financial crisis. Now, we talked about the tools in the toolbox. China had tools in the toolbox. How much tools can you have in the toolbox when monetary policy has driven interest rates down to below zero, to negative rates? But I think sooner or later, global investors will look at China in a different light again. Because falling growth rate from 8 to 6.5%, what does that mean? The base is now huge. 1% now is equivalent to 10% 15 years ago. And more than that, China really has to stabilize its economy and cannot be on a construction binge anymore. So I think the transformation of China will bring global investors to take a different light.
Here is a counter-argument against your note of pessimism about the economic outlook of the world. One of the major reasons for G20 to be held in Hangzhou is that Alibaba is located there, and it's a chairman, the founding father of Alibaba, Ma Yun, Jack Ma, said recently in fact, it's a very important proposal that the electronic world trade system should be set up. And in fact, this important proposal has been incorporated into the joint statement of the B20 summit. Do you think that's going to make a sea difference for the economic prospects?
Just one note on that, very quickly. The difference it's going to make is to create, again, a situation of greater unemployment in some countries. That's number one.
You mean that'll be a blow to the real economy? You mean manufacturing industries are likely to be undermined as a result of the boom of e-commerce?
No, the manufacturing industry will do well because you'll be selling more goods because it's more efficient. Who will not do so good? The logistics, the deliveries. What we have is, in the United States today, is already a decline of the white-collar worker and decline eventually of the blue-collar worker as well. What we have now is decline in medium income for 16 years now in the United States, and the number of white-collar workers are declining. Now, if you have automated systems, including automated stock trading systems, including automated all kinds of things, robotics and automation would take away further jobs. And I think that's going to cause serious social issues, like Uber has already done.
But, you know, I want to respond to Charles' comments in the light of your context of your question. It's not just one way or the other. You have many tools has to be utilized. Innovation on the whatever, you know, Alipay, Apple Pay, these are one of set of rules for consumer-driven convenience and more value-added service. But China may have exhausted or nearly exhausted its own infrastructural investment. That's exactly what AIIB, One Belt, One Road system coming in, because many other countries need such this. Yes. Even the Americans are talking about their own road and railway. So the Chinese model, quote unquote, the infrastructure investment model in large-scale expansion for job creation can be exported to developing countries, and that's where the beauty is on this G20. Many developing countries coming in.
Are you saying that overcapacity should be exported to
That's
other
exactly
countries?
what is actually happening.
Is that the bulk
Call
of
it
the
in a
Belt and
different
Road
way.
Is that the bulk of the One Belt and One Road initiative?
All these capacities has to be incorporated into those countries, not the Chinese going there build for them.
Well, let me go back to what Charles said earlier. The decline in the income of medium or middle class in the United States, one of them developed economies. Since the financial crisis in 2008, what can you tell us about the income of the middle class in terms of, for example, the latest statistics? Mainland China's trade with the United States continues to surge with a $366 billion trade deficit favoring Beijing last year alone. Does that mean that the middle class pocket is getting deeper? Quite contrarily against what you said about the purchasing power of the middle class.
Not at all. What have we seen in the last 12 months? Consumer debt has been increasing in double digits. In other words, banks are giving more money on credit cards for US consumers to spend money. And they are spending. And the other part that is really scary is the potential of funny mortgage arrangements coming back. This is what happened in before 2000.
Excuse me, are you saying yet another financial crisis is quietly making a comeback in the United States?
Absolutely, because what happened in 2008 before was that you can actually buy a house with zero money down. And in the UK, you can buy a house and the bank will lend you 10% on top to do furnishings. And these are type of things which can come back very, very quickly because the US economy needs consumption, needs people to have money in their pockets to consume. And how do you get that money? Sometimes you get it out of the value of your house or your other assets. And basically what is beginning to be seen is a decline in productivity in the United States. This is the first time in a century there was actually a decline in productivity. And what you have, if you have decline in productivity, declining income, you have to find some means to keep the consumption going. And that means increasing debt. And the increasing debt has already begun.
With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on the just concluded G20 summit in Hangzhou. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.